Welcome, welcome everybody. I'm very glad to be back at BTC Prague, third time in a row for me. And this time we try to reveal some of the magic under the hood. Probably if you're into Bitcoin, if you got into Bitcoin recently, you are mostly in for the price. We don't have to lie to each other. We are here for the money, number go up, we're going to be rich, we're going to the moon. But you know that Bitcoin has some characteristics that are driving this price and this adoption and this demand. And these characteristics, maybe you have heard of them in some podcast, immutability, resistance to corruption, resistance to confiscation, inflation. But how does this work? We will try to make it simple enough. We will try to give you a glimpse on about the workings, the mechanisms under the hood. And to do that, we have basically somebody who is an expert in each of the fields that we are going to touch. We will discuss the financial infrastructure, the software infrastructure, and the hardware infrastructure of Bitcoin. We have a lot of time, about 40 minutes, to get into it at some depth. But first, as always, let's have a round of self-introduction. So starting from Abubakar, who are you, what do you do, and then we go that direction.
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name is Abubakar Nur Khalil. I'm the CEO at BTrust. I'm also the board member there. Essentially decentralized Bitcoin development in the Global South. I'm also the CEO at Recursive Capital. It's a Bitcoin VC that invests in companies in Africa. I also write for Forbes and work on Bitcoin Core.
Hey everyone, I'm Daniela. I work on Bitcoin Core. I'm a software developer, so what I do is I write code. I've been working on Bitcoin for a few years now on various companies, and now I work on Bitcoin Core full-time. I work on the networking part. We will talk a bit more about that later, but basically I work on how nodes talk to each other and make sure that there's no privacy leaks when that happens.
Hi, I'm Bitcoin Mechanic. I used to work at Start9, now I work at Ocean. Highest level, it's really just about making Bitcoin practically usable for people in order to make it actually decentralized rather than theoretically decentralized. So in some cases that means making software just usable, and in other cases it means looking at how Bitcoin can be in practice used by as many people as possible without them having to compromise too much. If they want to, operate with ideological perfection, they need to have practical tools that allow them to use Bitcoin as it allows us to use it, and not, continue on the deadly trend towards centralization, the inexorable, decline. So it's all about fighting that and giving people the tools that make that possible.
Hi, I'm Lucas Ferreira. I'm the founder and executive director of Intune, a nonprofit Bitcoin research and development center focused on funding and onboarding developers to work in Bitcoin open source.
Okay, let's start from Daniela, because Daniela here is the base layer of is representing the base layer of Bitcoin. So when you use Bitcoin, you are moving value across the internet, and you cannot do that with your pencil and paper, not yet, unless you're very, very good. You need a computer. And to run on this computer, you need a software, which is a Bitcoin software. It could be a wallet, it could be a node with a wallet. I will ask Daniela to try to explain you in simple words, just a general introduction. Two things. First, how do different Bitcoin software running on different computers can agree on the single history, so a little bit about the consensus of Bitcoin, and also how can developers agree on how to build, improve, change this software, and with a particular focus on what makes this interaction safe from centralization and corruption.
Yeah, of course. So at the base of Bitcoin is actually a network of computers that all run what we call Bitcoin software. And that's often Bitcoin Core, but there's also other implementations of software. So imagine just this network of computers speaking to each other. Every time a new block is found, every time a new transaction is created, these computers just tell each other, oh, hey, there's this new block. Oh, hey, there's this new transaction. And they keep chatting the whole time. So what every single computer does after learning about a new block, a new transaction, is it validates it. It checks that it's OK, because every computer has an internal set of rules of what an OK Bitcoin transaction looks like, what an OK Bitcoin block looks like. So everyone just validates. And so imagine just all these computers. It's tens of thousands of computers all over the world. But every time they receive something, a block, a transaction, every single one of them just checks that it's OK. What happens if they have a disagreement? If some nodes say that a block is OK and some nodes say, no, that's not fine, actually, then we have what we call a fork. That is actually quite scary and quite dangerous, I would say. So what we all want to do is we want to run a software that is compatible, that has rules that are equal to each other, although it doesn't have to be the same software. So for example, there's Bitcoin Core and there's Bitcoin Nodes, where Mechanic also works on that, and they're not the exactly same software. But when it comes to what we call consensus, the base rules of blocks and transactions, Core and Nodes are actually in consensus. They have the same rules. Otherwise, that's very dangerous. So how do developers even decide how to change this? Well, there's smaller, actually quite small, I would say, teams that work on mostly Bitcoin Core and other implementations. And they just, someone every now and then proposes a new change. That can be a change that is not disruptive at all. Maybe they propose to implement a better interface, and that's completely fine. Everyone can have their own interface, and that's just fine, because it's not consensus, right? And sometimes people say, OK, I want to have a different consensus rule. For different rules proposed, there are different grades of how much we need to agree. So when it comes to maybe peer-to-peer, we need to quite agree on how nodes have to chat with each other. When it comes to GUI, that's not really important. Consensus, that is super important. So for the least important changes, developers just decide, and if someone disagrees, they can just fork the code and maintain their own version of Bitcoin software, and that's completely fine. When it comes to more involved changes, like changing consensus rules, then the whole community has to basically agree. Because if someone disagrees and they have some mining power, for example, that becomes it becomes dangerous, because you can have what we call forks. So how do developers decide? That's not easy to answer, maybe, because it's not like we have a rule on exactly how to say yes or no to every possible change. In general, we'd like to maintain the status quo, because we realize that Bitcoin works right now. And if we change it, it might not work perfectly. So if you want to change Bitcoin, you need to convince people that it makes sense to change Bitcoin. And then, yeah, when we want to touch on the more consensus rules on how blocks and transactions works, then we need this community agreement that, as you might guess, it's kind of hard to reach.
So status quo is the strong bias. If it works, don't change it. And if you want to change it, you really have to agree on how to improve it without damaging it. And that's the way that the software is built. And this software will arrange transactions in a strong chronology, which is immutable in the blocks. But if you are going to pay with sats outside here in order to buy some food at the food trucks, you will not enter a Bitcoin block, because the Bitcoin blockchain is a very slow structure, very resilient, very strong, very safe, but also very slow and inefficient. And if you want to buy something fast, if you want an instant payment experience, if you want a cheap payment experience, you stay out of the blockchain. I mean, my shirt right now is, you remember maybe, if you were into Bitcoin a few years ago, you can remember the mantra, blockchain without Bitcoin. That was utter bullshit, of course, but what we do have is Bitcoin without blockchain. So we can send sats around without touching the blockchain. That's called the Lightning Network. Lucas, you do education also about the Lightning Network. You did work firsthand on the Lightning Network. How is that working? So what's the difference when you are a Bitcoin wallet or node developer or a Lightning developer? How is the Lightning Network reaching consensus instead? Do we have the same kind of problems, different ones? Can it change faster or not really?
Yeah, definitely. layer 2s and side chains, side systems can move way faster and allow for a lot more parallel experimentation, because layer 2s are borrowing from Bitcoin layer 1's security and stability. So Bitcoin layer 1 needs to move conservatively and need to last forever, while layer 2s like Lightning can move faster, can experiment, and different implementations of the Lightning Network can be viable, can thrive in different scenarios and optimize for different use cases, specializations. So when you're talking about Lightning development or layer 2 sidechain or side system developments in general, you can play around with different trust assumptions and different levels of custodiability and different levels of like different scenarios of things you want to do. Lightning development specifically, there are 4 major implementations of it. There's a spec process. The Lightning Network protocol is actually spec, different from the Bitcoin protocol, which is basically the protocol is basically spec'd by the main implementation written by Satoshi. Although they improved a lot, the team working on Bitcoin Core improved a lot on like multi-process and different optimizations and different improving the code, so the consensus code is not so much interconnected with the rest of the code. There's the libBitcoin kernel project right now. So there are a lot of improvements there to allow for different clients to coexist. But on Lightning, since it came later, it allowed for more different teams working on different priorities and different things. And then there's like ARC and Fedimint and different other experimentations. That doesn't mean one is better than the other. They can complement each other. There are a lot of room for parallel experimentation on layer 2s and sidechains.
So you have Bitcoin nodes all agreeing on the same history of the blocks, and on top you have these second layers. Not only they are more flexible within themselves, but they can also live all together. You can have a single, for example, if you go to pay for something and you pay with an Aqua wallet, what you are doing is spending something on Liquid that will be atomically swapped with a Bitcoin Lightning transaction, and maybe this transaction will go through a Fedimint or through another sidechain, to a state chain, to Spark, to ARC. So that's very, very complex, but it's hidden under the hood so that you can just have a seamless payment experience. Now, this is all about software, so computer programs. But what about the hardware running it? You cannot have software without hardware. So mechanics, your name is already implying some physical expertise. I will ask you to tell me about 2 kinds of hardware infrastructure. The first one is touching the consensus layer, it is mining. So who is building the mining machines? Who is selling the mining machines? How do we prevent them from going rogue, from controlling the protocol? How decentralizes that? And then, on the second part of the question, when you run Lightning, do you need a special machine anyway? Because we think that we can just use a phone, but you were working with Star9 as well, and many people run a physical machine in order to have a proper Lightning node working. So where do you buy a miner? What is a mining hardware even made of?
It's really hard to answer because all of the Bitcoin is just a tool for people that want a practical solution, right? It's ideologically, it doesn't work. If you write out Bitcoin on paper, any academic will tell you that's never going to work. And that's why academics are useless and you should never listen to them. So in practice, mining is horribly centralized. Let's just be honest about it. Bitcoin still works because it's just that awesome, but it's definitely not adhering to the principles we'd like it to. In practice, 90% of the hardware pointed at Ocean, which is the pool I work for, which running a pool gives you certain insights into what the deeper network is doing. 90% of the hardware pointed at it is made by one company, Bitmain, who also control nearly everything that goes inside the, well, by virtue of making all the hardware and it being all closed source and presumably backdoored, they basically own that entire jurisdiction within Bitcoin.
But now they're all selling, so please say something positive.
Yeah, well,
now be truthful. Be truthful.
Bitcoin continues to operate despite having Achilles heels like that, which it basically, I shouldn't say it, but I'm going to say it. My opinion has never been that Bitcoin is unbelievably perfect. It's that everything else is way, way worse. So you have nothing else out there. If I disillusion you about how resilient Bitcoin might be, I'm not exactly up here saying, yeah, buy the dollar instead, because it's way, way weaker, obviously, and guaranteed to lose value. Bitcoin is utterly the best thing we have, but it has lots of decentralization and centralization are not black and white things. They are on some kind of spectrum. Bitcoin is, in many ways, way more decentralized than it used to be. The hash rate's way higher. You need a lot more compute power to be able to 51% attack the network that you used to. And if the difficulty plummeted all the way back to what it was in 2013, when it was still the most decentralized blockchain out there, it wouldn't survive because it has to continue to trend towards more and more decentralization. And there are so many different elements to the ecosystem. Some of them are great. So when it comes to mining in particular, mining is split up into multiple components. Hashing is just one of those components, and that is incredibly decentralized, which is great because there are so many different hashes around the planet. But the fact that they're all using, for the most part, Bitmain machines, and they're all closed source, and if we're thinking adversarially, we must also assume that they are backdoored, then that's not great, because then Bitmain, aka the Chinese government, basically has a backdoor to one element of the whole network. Not great, though there's been noise of, well, not just noise, but it looks like Block will come out with something to help blow all this out of the water. You also have a lot of people mining with bitaxes now, and bitaxes are unbelievably not powerful. And still, we've managed to find a few blocks with those because of just the sheer amount of Bitcoiners that want to help decentralize the network. And you have now Datum, which is the invention of Jason Hughes, who works for Ocean alongside me, who finally came up with a practical solution for miners not just being hashers, but also constructing their own block templates and broadcasting them directly to the network, but using a pool as well, because every single miner basically, give or take, wants to mine in a pooled context so that they can split rewards with other miners, lower their variance, and actually be able to pay their power bills and find a reasonable amount of money within a 2-week period, which Bitcoin kind of imposes on us. Jason came up with Datum, which is a practical solution for being able to do that, and so you now have over 100 blocks in the blockchain were made by miners that made their own blocks, so they are credibly miners again, they're not just hashers. And this has been a problem since Satoshi left. Everything turned into a couple of companies or a handful of companies deciding what goes in the blockchain, which is not decentralized enough. And we had to accept the fact that miners are always going to pool. We need to make it so that pools are no longer the arbiters of what goes in the chain and what isn't. So that's what Datum allowed for, and Datum is a protocol, it's open source. Ocean is the only pool that supports it at the moment. Obviously, we created it as well. And that is where miners are slowly starting to move towards. And it means they are running an additional piece of hardware, typically, and I'll get into Lightning in a second, like you alluded to. They're running something that is a Bitcoin node, which is mind-blowing, really, because for the last 13 years, miners with tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars worth of mining equipment were not running a Bitcoin node because there was no way for them to use it if they wanted to use a pool, which nearly all miners do. That's insane, and it's literally taken until 2024 for a protocol to come out that says, okay, here's what miners are actually doing, here's how you can carry on being sovereign, and you need a protocol that sits on top of your Bitcoin node and allows you to generate work for your machines locally, which has a ton of benefits, by the way, but also to split rewards with other miners using some third-party coordinator. That whole thing was just something that someone needed to build, and that's what Ocean built. So, and it's also extremely lightweight because it uses Stratum v1, so there's no real mess with it. We tested it with a Raspberry Pi. You could put a whole exahash through that, right? And that's 1/800th of the entire network going through a Raspberry Pi, which is insane. So typically miners now that are mining on Ocean, they might have a few hundred petahash. Some of them are even over an exahash. They'll run something like an Intel NUC, which, for $500-600, you're running a Bitcoin node. And you're looking at an operation with tens of millions of dollars in hardware. It's a rounding error. And that will run a datum server as well. That will allow them to split rewards, and it will allow them to generate work for their miners locally. And importantly, any blocks they find, they don't have to tell the pool and ask the pool to tell the network. They tell the network directly. So that's really, really what Bitcoin needed, and it's provably working. And additionally to that, hardware-wise, people running Lightning, the hard part has always been tunneling into your home network, really, because Start9 is the best practical solution out there for anyone that wants to be able to run a Bitcoin node and actually use it. So I run Electrum Wallet on my phone, and I have a VPN all the time tunneling into my home network so that I can connect to my Electrum server, which sits on top of my Bitcoin server. It's a bunch of pieces of annoying stuff, but it's totally necessary if I don't want to use a third-party thing, and that should be the default. Back in the day, back in 2011, when I got into Bitcoin, the only way to use Bitcoin was to download Bitcoin and open the app called Bitcoin, and that was it. And then slowly but surely, everything turned into third-party apps doing all the things that Bitcoin did on your behalf, and that became Bitcoin Core. And now it seemed like an optional thing. People will spend years Bitcoining, people will mine with hundreds of millions of dollars of hardware and never run a node, which means they've never used Bitcoin. They really haven't. If you own Bitcoin and it sits in an exchange, if you're using Lightning and you're using some sort of wallet where someone else runs a node on your behalf, you've never used Bitcoin. You really haven't. And it's Morpheus waking up Neo in the Matrix meme. Why do my eyes hurt? Because you've never used them before. This is how it feels telling miners to run a Bitcoin node. Like, why does Bitcoin feel so different now? Because you've never used it before. Someone else always has on your behalf, and that makes for a very weak network, because if people elect to use trusted third parties for things, then you slowly but surely turn into PayPal 2.0 again with its own PayPal coin that sits on top of it. And everything has to be done to stop that from happening. And that requires vigilance. And yeah, I guess I'll round off the price of freedom or good Bitcoin is eternal vigilance.
Abubakar, so software infrastructure, hardware infrastructure, financial infrastructure, how is the flow of money influencing all these? For example, grants, financial grants to core developers, can they influence the development? Can they stop the development? Maybe I remember the debate between Michael Saylor and the ETFs. Now you should not sponsor developers because they could change around. So is big money coming into Bitcoin slowing down the development? And how does that interact instead with mining, like with the possibility of more decentralized mining? Is big money coalescing into big centralized mining pool, which is public companies, or to a degree, cool money also disintermediate Bitmain by sponsoring you ASIC research? So how is money, big money, flowing into Bitcoin, interacting with all of this?
Yeah, so there are a variety of dynamics generally in the Bitcoin space, as we've seen on both the software side, the hardware side. And I think the financial component is just essentially a coalescence of all those aspects. So I'd say maybe I'll start with the mining side. When it comes to the mining side, like Mechanic was talking about, there are a variety of dynamics over the years that have happened, all the way from machines getting way more efficient with ASICs, all the way up to centralization with hardware manufacturers, and that obviously has implications for the bottom line for some of these companies, as well as the investors that engage in some of these explorations. So for context, if you're going to start a mining operation, typically the route would be either you finance the entire operation, which depending on what the megawattage is, that would be difficult for you to do so. So most people elect to go for essentially a route where they have the infrastructure, or maybe they just gather folks that will help with the infrastructure separately, which is an entire financial aspect, all the way up to having investors that will come in to put in finance for either that infrastructure or the actual ASICs, all the way up to the power deals that are struck. So there are a lot of dynamics with regards to even starting the mining operation itself. So that ranges from loan structures, other financial instruments to just finance the project, all the way up to revenue shares, all the way up to equity as well for companies, depending on how it's structured. So the dynamics play out mostly in the sense of there isn't exactly a direct correlation between the investors forcing things to happen, but capital dictates, essentially, which is kind of where the problem is. So the more investments go into a certain type of financial structure or mechanism, whether it's a loan or rev share, it kind of dictates what the landscape is like. And we've seen that over the last maybe 3 years in terms of some mining companies getting too over leveraged, which is why we saw some of the collapses, all the way up to some being more, I wouldn't say ideologically driven, but more aware to some of the factors that Mechanic was talking about with regards to decentralization. Because overall, you will make money, technically speaking, if everything's a lot more decentralized and actually reveals the kind of dynamics that we see, or at least the variety of different hashers around the world. So there are some investors that look at it from that long-term horizon versus some that are looking to kind of make a quick buck as well. So we've seen some of that to bleed into some of the payout mechanisms on the mining pool side, whether it's FPPS versus PPLNS, and kind of how that affects rewards, whether it's trying to maximize variance or kind of minimize variance for the upside. So on the mining side, that's kind of how the dynamics play out. In terms of the software development side, grants have been traditionally very difficult, generally when it comes to open source, given the fact that most software runs on open source tech, but it's very difficult to get funding to actually support that infrastructure, which is kind of ironic because you would have assumed if it's so critical to all infrastructure, there will be a lot more consideration about how to make it sustainable. So over the years, we've seen a handful of organizations giving grants, which really doesn't help out in terms of centralizing that, because grants don't necessarily influence, but like I said, capital dictates, essentially. So it also has the same issue that the financial side has, where it's kind of a different dynamic. It's not, I give you a grant to work on Bitcoin Core, ensure there's op return changes, or whether it's removing the supply cap. It's really more a sense of the culture of that organization and kind of the set of developers that they already fund. And typically, if an organization wants to influence, they wouldn't directly tell the developers to do something. It's more a case of connecting them with other like-minded individuals that share their same interests. So that's kind of how the dynamics play out. It's more a soft power approach as opposed to directly change this. And in terms of where we are right now, there are a lot more funding sources, which is good for Bitcoin developers, generally speaking. So you're not beholden to a single org. If you decide this org is maybe trying to use these type of tactics, you can go off to a different organization to fund you. And now even for developers in the Global South, previously there wasn't exactly a straightforward pathway for them to get funding, which is why BTrust was created. And now we've gotten to the stage where there's a lot more funding with regards to whether starting out all the way up to long-term funding, even longer-term funding, 2 years and above. So I say where we are right now in terms of the funding side is all those dynamics I described in the mining. In terms of the grant side, there's definitely a lot more variety. I think the only thing we have to be vigilant about is making sure that everyone around the community is aware of some of these dynamics so we can call out things when we see it, and also to make developers aware, because it's not that straightforward for some of the developers, especially the younger developers, to see some of these dynamics playing out and kind of step aside or understand what's happening. So I get the angle of not wanting everyone to be involved on the financial side, because not everyone is here for the same reason or the right reasons, or even reasons that are entirely consistent with Bitcoin's thesis. So that's kind of where the dynamics are. Capital just dictates at the end of the day, depending on where it's deployed. So that's how it's influenced. And yeah, as a community, we just have to keep being vigilant eternally, like Mechanic mentioned.
It's very interesting. There is a passage in Games of Thrones in which they ask if there is a room with a king and a banker and a priest and a captain of a mercenary guild, who is in command, and it's basically a very complex interaction. Money can buy competence, but competence can actually screw money and bypass it, and then you have raw power of physical machines. So that's very interesting. For the last few minutes, let's do a quick round about how to turn this beautiful understanding of complex power dynamics into practice. So, for example, many people start Bitcoin with just buying some credit in an exchange. But then maybe they want to move to their own private keys on an open source wallet. And then, as Mechanic was saying, you are not really running Bitcoin until you run a node, but then running a node on Lightning is more complex. So a quick round about how would you suggest a progression on moving from a pure Bitcoin speculator into an actual Bitcoin actor. So starting maybe with Daniela, should everybody start running a node? Why and how?
I think so, but it might not be that easy when you start out. So definitely, if you want to run a node, I think that's great, and you should do that. Because running a node, yeah, it does help the network, because you have this computer. It can be a dedicated computer. It can also be just your laptop that runs a software that is connecting to the network, and it's sending blocks and transactions, as I was saying before, to other nodes. But it's very important for your own privacy, because every time you use a wallet, that wallet is connected to a node, to a Bitcoin node. And if you don't know that it's connected to your node, it's connected to someone else's. And that someone else can see things like maybe it can see your IP address. Okay, maybe you do a Tor, it can see your transactions for sure. And it can see a lot of metadata that can just, it just have a lot of info about you. And if you're here in Bitcoin, I think you should care about privacy, about the fact that third parties shouldn't know about how you want to spend your money, and they shouldn't be able to block you, to stop you from doing that. So having a node is extremely important. There's a lot of solutions that are already pre-packaged. So maybe you buy a kind of Raspberry Pi or some small machine that you just put on your desk and it works. But I think the first step should be to just download maybe Bitcoin Core or some Bitcoin software on your laptop just to see how that works. Make sure to do what's called pruning, so you don't save the whole blockchain, but just maybe the last few gigabytes. It still takes a lot of storage on your computer, sadly, because I think you need about 20 or 30 gigabytes on your computer, but it's not too much. So I think that's an awesome, maybe second step. I think the first step should be to self-custody your coins. And so you should learn about what's your seed, how you can back up your private keys, and how, and you should also learn what's the advantage of having your own keys. Why is that even important? Because then people can stop you from using your money however you want.
Mechanic, is the third step running a BitX?
It could be. I love the BitX thing because these are my spirit animals, people doing it, but they are all still Bitmain chips on the inside of it. So it's not as amazing as we want. So back to the parent question here. I guess the best way really is to get into it is to leave your Bitcoins on an exchange and then get robbed, or have it get seized or something like that. And like, not everyone likes to learn the hard way, but a lot of people do. And it tends to be a good thing every cycle if something goes catastrophically wrong, like Quadriga or Mt. Gox or FTX. Something needs to collapse, and then a whole new wave of Bitcoiners go, oh, I get it now. I should have had control over my own money. That is the entire point of this thing. Otherwise, it's just gold 2.0, and it will suffer the same fate as gold. If your Bitcoins are not under your control, then you don't have, then there are no 21 million. Because if it's the same group of custodians telling everyone how much coins they have, then it's not genuinely scarce anymore, and people are trading what we call paper Bitcoin, right? So it undermines the system as a whole. It makes absolute scarcity much more approximate, and it does start to become reminiscent of precious metals and things like that. And I don't know, it's a blurring of the lines between altruism and, but also people just living by correct principles. And I always use the Second Amendment analogy. It's not going to change a country if you go and buy a weapon, but it is going to be a very different country if you can rely on the fact that every single person in your community is armed and they know how to use it. That makes for a much more free society necessarily, because the turnkey tyranny police state thing is just, it's very hard to do if cops know that every single dude walking down the street is carrying. So if everyone in Bitcoin is generally running their own node and generally storing their own coins at their own thing, and if they're using things like Lightning, they're using their own Lightning node too, and they're doing all this in a sovereign capacity, then Bitcoin is just hard, because you have to go to every single Bitcoiner and undermine what it is they're doing, rather than go to a couple of companies like MicroStrategy or Coinbase and say, hey, we're confiscating all this. When it cannot get, it's probably a square root of users that have to be sovereign, uncompromising, paranoid crypto-anarchists, as Michael Saylor would call them. You need at least the square root of the total amount of Bitcoiners or something to have that hardline mentality. Otherwise, the system just becomes much more fragile and centralized, something like that.
Lucas, on the first layer, it's trivial, at least to start. You just download Bitcoin Core or Knots or something, and you just run it. For second layers, and Lightning in particular, is it still a reasonable request? Or after you install a Lightning node, the liquidity management, the uptime, you cannot run a Lightning node on your laptop like a Core node, right? It's way more complicated.
Yeah, there are multiple additional complexities of running a Lightning node, because you need to run open Lightning channels and then manage liquidity. Although there are lots of improvements that are coming, and automating, making it easier and less dependent on the user to manage all that. Like, there are even now mobile wallets that are pushing the bar of usability and making it easier to run a Lightning node on your own phone. But I think more important than that, like I think it's important for you all to get out of this panel understanding that although the title of the panel is Behind the Magic, Why Bitcoin Technology Just Works, it doesn't just work. It works because there are multiple people involved in making sure it works. And there's multiple not only developers, but also educators and journalists and advocates, and everyone is involved in making sure that all the pressures and the centralization vectors are being pushed away from Bitcoin and making it more. Bitcoin will only be inevitable if we are all working to make it inevitable. So I think that's important to understand.
Nice, nice. Abubakar, very quick in 1 minute. I have some money. Sats are going to overperform any other asset class, most likely. So should I still try to do Bitcoin VC or Bitcoin private equity investing company? Does it make sense for somebody with money to invest in Bitcoin in industry when you just have Sats?
Yeah, so I'd say very briefly, what you should do is meet the Bitcoin ecosystem at your current capacity and try to grow over time. So if you do have enough capacity at a whale level, then definitely go the VC route, or you could go the mining opportunity route, or even the ETF route, depending on what your sense is. And on the individual level, definitely start with self-custody, and then gradually grow kind of your understanding and see if you can run a node, etc. But that's what I recommend, definitely meet the Bitcoin ecosystem at your level of capacity.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Secure your BTC Prague 2026 ticket at the lowest possible price now.